President Kagame, I think your response echoes so much of the sentiments we've been hearing in many of the panel discussions of the last few days. As you speak about food and its centrality to human life, we're reminded of the conversation this morning that this should be seen as a national security issue because food is that important. As you talk about the fact that we know what to do and we have the toolkits, one of the resounding sentiments earlier was, well, what these crises have done is they've exposed the issue, but the issue has been there and we know the challenges, so now it's time for us to get done. And of course you call on us to do so with urgency. So let me build on that and let me come to President Mnangagwa next with a question to you, sir. I want to stay within the context of these crises, and the question to you is, what impact have these crises had on Zimbabwe? And what has this meant in terms of your agricultural policies, your plans, and your ambitions for the country in response to these crises that we're facing right now?
Well, thank you very much for the question, moderator. But now, fortunately, under the Second Republic, we introduced a model to say we need to have food security on the basis of our own domestic resources. So with regard to the importation of wheat from Ukraine, I'm happy to say in the past, Zimbabwe used to grow only about 3 months of supply of wheat for the country. And under the model we've introduced this last season, we have now been able to produce 13 months of wheat supply for Zimbabwe, which means we now have an excess of 1 month of wheat. And so the crisis relating to importation of wheat from Ukraine does not affect us. We are now on our own. With regard for the purpose of background and context, allow me to highlight to our esteemed audience here the Zimbabwe situation, because my country has been under sanctions for the last 20 years. So I'm going to reply to this question with that background as a context of our situation. Over the last 2 decades, about 22 years now, Zimbabwe has been under Western sanctions. And ultimately, this has affected our capacity to import certain essential requirements. With regard to specific issues of food security, Zimbabwe, since independence, we have been importing our wheat for our bread from Ukraine, and our fertilizer from the Russian Federation.
Yes.
But to the issue of grain which we eat, that is maize, corn, we also have a model where now we realize, because of the issue of climate change in the country, we have introduced a program the last 2.5 years to 3 years now. In every single province in Zimbabwe, we are building dams, and we are also introducing irrigation. We need 360,000 hectares of land under irrigation, and we know that by next season we will have completed that exercise, and we shall be sufficient with regard to grain again. Whether there is drought or there is no drought, we are achieving that goal. So, yes, we have challenges with regard to the issue of gas and fuel in Zimbabwe that we import. To some extent, the issues in Europe have affected us. But I think as an African country and as a continent, so many countries in Africa have gone under serious challenges. I'm aware of the challenges Zimbabwe has faced, but when we were facing these challenges, Europe went to sleep. They never bothered about the fact that an African country was facing challenges. And in my view, I don't know whether my colleagues will agree with me, but in my view, Zimbabwe would not fail to sleep because other countries in Europe have problems. But of course, the biggest challenge is the question of the pandemic.
Yes.
And you may be aware that when the pandemic visited the entire globe, many countries received support from the World Bank, IMF, the first world supported many countries. Zimbabwe did not receive anything because we're an isolated country. We did the support from our own African brothers, not from outside Africa. So, as a result of that, we began to think outside the box.
Yeah.
We've provided our own PEs sufficient to deal with our own situation. And we also had got to be squeezed on the question of accessing medical oxygen. And we put a group of scientists in our own country, and within 15 months, we are now in production of our own medical oxygen, and we have surplus for those who may want it. For now, I think I may end there.
Thank you very much, President Mnangagwa. And I do want to just highlight a few things that are just very important. One of the lines that you've delivered, you said, this crisis does not affect us. And I think it really gets to the core of the nub of this conversation. How do we begin to reduce the vulnerabilities? How do we begin to ensure that we are not vulnerable to external shocks? And of course, what we're hearing in your narration is that in the midst of the crisis, Zimbabwe built its resilience. And
but now, fortunately, under the Second Republic, we introduced a model to say we need to have food security on the basis of our own domestic resources. So with regard to the importation of wheat from Ukraine, I'm happy to say in the past, Zimbabwe used to grow only about 3 months of supply of wheat for the country. And under the model we've introduced this last season, we have now been able to produce 13 months of wheat supply for Zimbabwe, which means we now have an excess of 1 month of wheat. And so the crisis relating to importation of wheat from Ukraine does not affect us. We are now on our own. With regard...
And ladies and gentlemen, as you've heard, excess wheat, if anybody is willing and wanting to get wheat from Zimbabwe and others. Thank you very much for that, President Mnangagwa.